Welcome back to the Unnamed Game Co. Worldbuilding series, episode 5. Okay, so how? Part 4, Allies and Structures. The title is still too long, but we're rolling with it. My name is Caradwin, they, them pronouns. If you haven't seen episode 1 through 4, maybe take a look at them. They give you a lot of context for what we're talking about today. If you have already seen those episodes and you came back for this one, thank you. I appreciate that. Today we are talking about allies. So last time we talked about villains, and allies are sort of important for being the light in the world, but they also have to show the gray. There's a lot of gray area in between being a hero and a villain, and your player characters, as well as most of your NPCs, should fall somewhere in that gray area because nobody is perfectly good and nobody's perfectly evil. The structures that we use to support those allies are often very similar to the structures that we'll use to support our villains, the corporations and the governments and things like that. So today I want to talk about, how we take those sort of ideas for what makes a good villain and use them to give us ideas of how we're going to make good allies. Again, we're focusing on things that have already happened, things that are past, things that are going to exist in the world before your player characters start playing the game. So we're not worried about how we're going to be changing these things, but we're worried about building in opportunities for mysteries to be uncovered and building in backstories to justify how the world works and why the allies work within this world. Because, let's be honest, it's not easy being a good person. It's very expensive, it's difficult, there are a lot of obstacles to overcome, and the structures that support your allies are going to help justify them in the world and make them more realistic. So, let's get into it. What is an ally? A person or organization that cooperates with or helps another in a particular activity. And it's the particular activity here that's really important. Alliances are not always permanent things, and a lot of time there's a transactional quality to an alliance that can make it kind of a difficult thing to maintain. And as you change as a person, sometimes your alliances are also going to shift and change. So as your player characters move through the world, their allies might change. Also, as you become more close to somebody, you build a stronger relationship, your allies can become things like friends. And having that growth into a friend helps to give your players access to more information. So your allies have to be complex and they have to be people. Even if they are representing an organization, by creating characters to go with your non-player characters, you're going to help give them depth so that you can understand why they are cooperating or helping with a particular activity. So along the lines of those complicated alliances, let's look at some of the qualities of an alliance. So typically when you have an alliance with somebody, you share a goal. You don't necessarily have the same motivations for what you're trying to do. These can be alliances of convenience, and sometimes the alliances are just a temporary thing, right? Where it's contingent upon achieving a particular thing. And once that goal has been achieved, then maybe that alliance dissolves. And that's something that can happen. But also sometimes when the goal is achieved, the alliance continues and it grows because this has been mutually beneficial, right? So there's a transactional quality to alliances that are usually tied around these mile markers, these goals. Another thing about allies is that they aren't necessarily going to be perfectly helpful all the time. Like this video game mentality of you walk up to a quest giver, they give you a quest, and you know pretty much right off the bat what the quest is going to be and why they want it, and they tell you a sob story about how Timmy fell down a well, etc., blah, blah, blah. And that is very boring. It's much more interesting when your allies don't necessarily trust the player characters and the player characters have to earn their trust, and over time the player characters discover more things and get access to more information because they start earning that trust. Or maybe the allies have larger plans where they are using the player characters to achieve an end which may or may not actually be in the best interest of the player characters in achieving their own goals. And sometimes your NPCs can withhold information either on purpose or just because they don't know something. It's entirely possible that they could send the player characters to go try and do something and not be aware of what is all involved because they're thinking, oh, I need to get Timmy out of the well. They're not necessarily thinking, oh, there's a monster that lives in that well. And that kind of withholding of information helps to create interest and nuance and depth so that your player characters are able to make those discoveries, which is going to help your allies feel more realistic because in the real world, sometimes people ask you to do things or tell you to do something without knowing all the context around it themselves. Another thing about allies is that they don't usually work with the villains, and I bring this up in particular because in a lot of media lately, there's been the, oh, what a twist, the bad guy was manipulating the heroes all along, ha ha ha, and that's kind of been done. Like we can move past this now, thank you. But every now and then you do have a double agent where you've got an ally who is posing and they're actually, motivated by other things that the player characters don't know about. Sometimes they are genuinely good people who are being used as pawns by the villains. So when you're building your alliance structures and you want to, go down that path of building in these difficult double agent stories, you need to really think about how that's going to affect the structure of your alliance. There's only so many times that you can pull this trick as well. So you need to make sure that the ways that you're implementing it are interesting, unique, and well justified within the world. It has to make sense for somebody to have this double agent life. It has to be a complex and interesting thing, because if your ally is just like, aha, pull off the Scooby-Doo mask, it was me all along, that's going to feel campy and fall flat. But if that's what you're going for, you do you. And the best kinds of alliances, I think, are the alliances of convenience. We talked a little about this with the shared goals, but when you have a group of people who are not necessarily super friendly, you can have these short-term alliances which give you so much information. Your player characters don't often have a chance to talk to the bad guys, and it can be really interesting to give them a different perspective and force them to work with somebody who they might not otherwise have a conversation with, and give them the opportunity to learn about the perspectives of the other side. And these kinds of limited duration alliances also open up the opportunities for backstabbing or for growth. And as you can tell by my tone, the growth is what interests me. I really love it when your player characters are given the opportunity to change their mindset and think, maybe there's something to this. Maybe these bad guys that, we've been just hating on this whole time, and maybe they're not all bad. Again, it's all about adding complexity, and complexity is what makes alliances fun. It's what makes your game fun. It's what makes your world fun. So when you're building in these alliance structures, you want to be thinking about all the different ways that you can use it to give interesting details, interesting story nuggets, and to give your player characters opportunities to solve mysteries. And touching back on those excellent villains, because your excellent villains have the opportunity to become excellent allies, your excellent allies should have basically the same qualities, where they have these interesting motivations, they serve as foils to your protagonists and exemplify certain things about your player characters. Their alliance structure should be growing in power at the same time as your player characters, and they should grow in response to things that the player characters have done. And your allies should be able to change their relationship to the player characters as well. And this can be in either a positive or a negative direction, where they can move away from the player characters and become more on the evil spectrum, or they could become closer to the player characters and become true friends, which is the best kind of ally to have. So in general, when you're looking at your allies, there are three major groups that your allies will fall into. Either they are more powerful entities that are giving directions or instructions. These are like your quest givers, or they can be equally powerful, where maybe they are giving direct support or receiving direct support from the player characters, or they can be less powerful, where they are asking for help, like they need aid, and this is a different kind of quest giver. But to me, the most exciting kind of ally is the one that can move in between these different states, where they start off as one thing and they become another one. And this isn't even getting into like the interpersonal relationships, where they can become friendly or they can become more antagonistic. Like all that kind of stuff can also happen within this, because your allies need to also be characters. And because I am who I am, I'm using an example from Star Wars. Wedge Antilles is kind of just a background character, is not particularly important to the movies, but in the extended universe, we get to see Wedge Antilles move from like a professional relationship into something more like a friend, because they've proved themselves, they're trustworthy, they do a lot of saving and receiving saving sometimes. But they grow up through the ranks and they develop a close personal relationship with our sort of main protagonists. And in many ways, Wedge is his own little protagonist. We like Wedge. So you can have these allies that move from being, people who receive help to people who are directly helping to people who are almost on par with the protagonists in terms of their power and storytelling. And sometimes your player characters awaken a rat and crown him the Rat King, and they return from time to time to the Rat King's court to pay homage to their friend the Rat King. And you know what? That is also okay. And now let's briefly address DMPCs. What is a DMPC, you ask? Boy, I wish I knew better. So I'm definitely not an expert in DMPCs, because I think the concept of a DMPC is bad. Here's my understanding of what a DMPC is. A game master wanted to play in a tabletop role-playing game. No one was running any games. So the game master runs the tabletop role-playing game, and they also play in the game that they are running. And that seems like a conflict of interest at best. At worst, it's like having the doctor in the operating room being the one operated on, who's just like, it's cool, bruh, just like numb me from the neck down. I'll do the surgery with you. It just sounds like a very bad idea. But I can definitely understand the appeal of embedding yourself into the gamer group because you want to play the game, and maybe you have a really justifiable reason, like you have a group of players. No, I cannot think of any real reason to use a DMPC. The arguments for using a DMPC that I found online were like, oh, maybe you don't have enough players, and like it's hard to run a game with only like 2 players, so you have a DMPC who's it would just run an NPC. I think an NPC is más bueno in my opinion. I feel like the difference between a DMPC and an NPC is that your DMPC is going to be statted like a player character. They're going to play in combats like a player character, and maybe they do roleplay like a character, so maybe they engage and the DM just like locks away all of their meta knowledge to try and be this character. I'm not really sure how it would work in roleplay, but I don't really think that DMPCs are as common in roleplay heavy games. That's just my guess. Tell me if I'm wrong. And this is contrasted by an NPC who doesn't need stats. They can do whatever the game master wants, and they can be used as a tool in roleplay to help motivate the game or to give context or information. I feel like the DMPC has a very strong chance of becoming part of the cutscene syndrome, where you've got this great story that's happening for this DMPC who's super well integrated into the world because, you know, the person who's running the game is building the character. And I feel like that takes away from the experience of the players somewhat, and I'm sure that it could be done very, very well. And I am definitely guilty of using way too many NPCs. I put so many NPCs around my party and sometimes traveling with them. I think at my biggest count in my group of 5 players, I had 7 NPCs, and that's not even counting the semi-sentient goats. So, you know, I definitely use a lot of NPCs. But for me, it is important that the NPCs are not players. They are tools of the world, they are tools of the story, they are there for the player characters to use, to learn from, to talk to, and they are not supposed to be the focus of the story. And I feel like DMPCs run the risk of becoming that. And if you are just using a DMPC to fill in a mechanical gap in your like combat, I feel like it would be more interesting to give your player characters opportunities to overcome that obstacle within the world. For example, if you have a group of players who do not have a healer, you can just integrate that into the game where it's like, cool, so you don't have a healer, and that means that you need to stock up on potions, which means you need to form a relationship with a local alchemist, and local alchemist also has needs that, you know, the party can fill, and now you start building an alliance with an NPC, and that I think is more interesting than, okay, cool, I'll just roll up a cleric and I will play the cleric with you. Also, combat already takes so freaking long. Why would you add another character? Anyway, moving on. So, there are some really cool things you can do with your NPCs. For example, from my favorite video game, and I don't play a lot of video games, so maybe this isn't saying much, but, you know, I love Fallout New Vegas. And in Fallout New Vegas, you have the opportunity to travel with companions, and these companions are really well written for giving you context and information about things that have happened in the world. They have very interesting points of view on certain events that have happened and the different factions and stuff. And as you form your relationship with this NPC ally, you start to get more of that information. The example that I love most is Boone, who is a character that experienced a massacre, which you hear about from lots of different people, but Boone was actually there, and you get to hear the story from Boone firsthand, and it really brings up a lot of interesting, conflicting information compared to things that you've heard from the world, and gives you a different perspective on the conflict, and really puts a human face on this terrible thing that happened. So when you're building your allies into your world, you can think about what story elements of your world building, like we talked about how you integrate those past stories into your world, what story elements can we bring forward with these NPCs? What perspectives, what context can we give? What sort of human face can we put on these stories and tragedies, and the good things too? Especially if you are running a world that has lots of factions and structures and governments and organizations, having the ability to provide an alternative point of view and perspective can be really useful. And speaking of that, let's start talking about some of those structures. So as you are building your villains and your allies and the structures that support them, you want to touch back on your game objectives. Compare those structures to the genres and the themes, and look out for your tropes and your stereotypes. And as you start integrating these villains and rivals and these allies, you need to be building up the structures that are going to make it possible for them to exist. I think sometimes we hand wave this stage because, there's always a government. But how did that government come into power is really important, because when you have something like the British Empire versus America, the way that those two different political structures formed is really important, and it gives you context for the kinds of people who are within them, and you can see the trajectory and the growth and how they have changed. The ideals and the core structure of any organization are going to be very important for how they fit into the world. And I mean, at the end of the day, these structures have to be supported by people, and people have to eat food. So you have to find reasonable ways to explain how these organizations continue to exist and survive. Even though, maybe they're trying to do something that is good or evil, they still have to pay the bills and keep the lights on. And to be fair, I am looking at this from an American point of view, where everything in my entire life is built around how I'm going to pay the bills. So I think about my world building within the context that I come from, and I come from the context of, well, I would sure love to just foster kittens for my entire career, but that doesn't keep the lights on, so I have to go work a job. And because of that compromise sort of built into the DNA of who I am as a person, that becomes part of my world building. I would be super interested to hear from somebody who doesn't think about these things and why you don't think it's important. So if you have that perspective, please share it in the comments. I would be very interested to know how other people think about this stuff, because I'm constantly thinking about how the structures in my world continue to exist financially, because, just being a good person is still very expensive. Anyway, so moving on. The primary structures that you have for your allies, and often your villains, are your governments, religions, sort of nonprofit organization kind of things, and your businesses. And each one of these has different challenges to its functioning and different nuance and depth. And I'm not going to go super in deep on any one of them, but in broad strokes, we're looking at what these organizations and structures provide for your world. Much like individual characters have their motivations, your structures are also going to have their motivations and their general views on things, which individuals within those organizations and structures might not necessarily adhere to, but that is the driving force for the actions that the structure and organization takes. And that's going to result in conflicts. And there are going to be organizations that oppose each other and sometimes are directly antagonistic or even go to war with each other. And that means that there's going to be collateral and fallout. So we need to be thinking about how these structures relate to each other and how the allies and the villains fit into those structures. Are they exemplars of the ideals of these structures that they're part of? Or are they, working against them? Are they double agents kind of thing? And what about the structures are those allies and villains going to bring out and shed light on? And perhaps most importantly, how are these structures going to impact my player characters? You obviously can't plan for every single interaction when you're doing your world building, but you want to think about sort of your goals for how you think your player characters will be interacting with these structures and what sort of story and plot you plan to have come out of these structures. Because if your whole idea is that we're going to have a cult of druids who want to destroy civilization because they think that it belongs to the trees, then that's going to have a whole bunch of interesting implications for how your player characters are going to interact with them. If you imagine that your player characters are coming from the point of view of, we love cities, we think cities are great, then they might see these druids as a villainous group. But if you're starting all of your player characters in a sleepy forest where they live in tree houses, then they might see the druids as good guys. So the perspective that you are putting into your world for your player characters starting home base and their experiences and circumstances are going to impact how they interact with these structures. And if you are leaving character creation totally up to the players, then you have no way to plan. So you have to try and cover the bases of providing information for how these structures and organizations are both good and bad. And that kind of nuance is going to be very helpful. In general, when building your structures, I think there are a couple things that you should, in general, avoid, such as good versus evil, order versus chaos, and just implausible, impossible, unjustified, unreasonable goals, because those kinds of things immediately make the structures harder to buy into. For example, if you have a group of druids who are like, we want to kill all civilization, okay, but why? And like, what's your beef with humanity? Why are you doing this? Like, you have to have reasons and motivations. If it's just trees good, people bad, bruh, you are people. And those kinds of logical inconsistencies just don't really make a lot of sense. But if you go into detail and start fleshing out those greater concepts and be like, well, they believe in natural order, and the natural order is that, trees need to exist in the world to feed humans, and because there are humans reproducing at a rate faster than the trees, then we need to create balance. Well, okay, that makes a lot more sense. And avoiding these broad concepts with no nuance is also going to help make it more realistic and more grounded in reality, which, for a fantasy world may seem antithetical, but your fantasy world will be more immersive if you are building it based off of realistic concepts. And in the real world, structures are not just one thing. They're not all good or all bad. They have lots of nuance and depth to them. And I want to talk about 2 real world examples. I'm not an expert on either one of them, but I do think they kind of exemplify what I'm talking about here. You have probably heard of Al Capone, and he was a big mob boss, right? And that might be all you ever know about him. But if you look into his history a little bit, he comes from a poor family that immigrated to America. He dropped out of school and started working like bowling alleys and like being a bouncer for a club, and he fell into the wrong crowd, right? And he ended up working with bootleggers and making tons of money that way. And he was incredibly popular. He ran for political office and won. He was very well liked, and he did a lot of good for the communities that he was in, which is kind of weird to think about. This person was a well-known criminal, like really well-known for criminal activity. Everybody knew that he was a criminal, and yet people loved him. He got a reputation for being like a Robin Hood figure, and he owned police officers and entire police departments, and that exposed huge corruption within our law enforcement agencies. So like, if you were a person playing a game where Al Capone was the big bad guy, it would be kind of difficult to go to see a baseball game and have Al Capone show up and the crowd starts cheering. Hooray! The mob boss is here. And your player characters might be a little bit confused. And part of being the mob leader meant that he was leading a structure, and he developed a lot of the structural features that we commonly associate with the mob in America, where, you have the bosses and the lieutenants and, the code phrases that they would use to have conversations and stuff. Like, all of that was part and parcel of Al Capone's life, and he developed this massive structure that spanned across cities and states, which he used to do crime. Do not forget, doing crime. He was able to leverage this organization into being a force of good for the people that he recognized himself in. The immigrants, the poor, the people who didn't have a voice in politics and government. He was buying off politicians and cops so that he could do crime and then use that money to do good things. But that's something that really happened, and you can integrate stuff like this into your game. Now let's switch gears to a different kind of organization. Let's talk about Goodwill. If you are from the US, you know this is a thrift shop where you can go and donate the crap that you don't want, and they sort through it, resell it for less money than you paid for it probably. In general, that's good. It reduces waste. They're also creating jobs, and they talk a lot in their ad campaigns about how they're creating jobs for veterans and people with disabilities and stuff like that. But let me tell you, friend, there's some controversy here. Goodwill Industries uses something called the special wage certificate, which means that if they hire somebody with a disability, they can pay them less than a minimum wage because the work that they're getting out of that person is of less value because they are disabled. And if that sounds insane, well, kind of. There's a lot of controversy here because there are two sides to the argument. The one side is, well, these people probably couldn't work at all, so the fact that they can get a job is good, and they're probably receiving assistance from the state or something for, their housing and things, so they don't need to make as much money. Plus, because our disability law is so crazy, we restrict the amount of money that people can make anyway. So by paying them less, we're giving them the opportunity to work, which can be very fulfilling. It can help people feel more connected to their environment. They take a lot of pride in their work. It gives them something to do to, pass the time between waking and sleeping. And that's like really good. And it can help them form friendships and work on their, physical mobility stuff if they're in rehab and things like that. Like there are lots of justifications for why this is a good thing. However, the base salary for the CEO of Goodwill in 2013 was $350,000 a year. At that same time, the lowest paid worker for Goodwill made $1.40 per hour. Yep. So at the same time that this company is providing these wonderful benefits for people, it is also, kind of immorally and unjustifiably shortchanging these people for the value of their time and energy. And that's bad. We shouldn't do that. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance that I'm not going into depth here, but this illustrates my point here where no structure is perfect. All of these allies and villains and the structures that support them have nuance and depth, which makes them interesting. And I think that's a pretty good place to end the episode for today. Basically, if you've been paying attention to the series, what you really need to do is make stuff interesting. And that means coming up with the reasons for why things are the way they are. This all ties back into that logical conclusion. If you think about the justifications for why things exist, what you're doing is you're building into your internal consistency and creating those logical conclusions so that the aspects of your world that you're playing with make sense. It makes sense for them to be there and you understand basically how they operate. And that helps your player characters engage with the world more because everything fits together. There's rationale and there's logic behind it. And then you have something that doesn't make sense, like Al Capone showing up to the baseball game and the crowd going wild and being super excited and happy to see him. And the player characters are like, wait a second, didn't that guy just commit a whole bunch of murders and crimes? So, that's what you do. You create the structure and then you break it. And speaking of structures, next time we're going to be talking about geography. Oh, the map. I know you're so excited. I think that it's important to discuss the geography of places towards the end because a lot of people start by drawing a map, and that's not how I do my world building at all. I build a map to fill in my world. So we'll talk about the geography next episode. Thank you again for watching. I know the series has been, kind of long, and we probably have another, 3 or 4 episodes left. So thank you so much. And if you like it, like it. If you want to follow along, do the subscribe thing and comments. I love comments. Give me your thoughts. And now, if you care to stick around, we're going to take a trip to the Cascadon Corner. So last time in the Cascadon Corner, we talked about Sessic, and he's evil and bad, etc., blah, 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 and he's also the god of healing. Well, there's another god of healing. This deity is Asia, and Asia is a dead god, which I think is really cool. I've talked about Asia before, I believe, but anyway, moving on. So the Church of Asia is one of the most traditional style structures of religion that I have in my setting. Asia is the goddess of sacrifice, so it makes sense to me that there would be this sort of non-profit style religious structure to the Asian temple where they do really depend on donations and stuff to be able to survive. They can't just function by themselves, and people make sacrifices to the Temple of Asia in the form of monetary compensation or labor and things like that, and that's how the church continues to exist. They also have some money-making practices where they will sell things. And the things that they're selling are usually not anything too elaborate. It's not like they're out there, making gold rings to sell to royalty. They're doing things like selling food at reduced prices or creating goods and things to sell to, tourists and travelers and things like that. But the primary source of their income is the sacrifices that are made in honor of Asia. One of the other ways that they fund themselves is by dismantling Sasekian temples, because Sasekian temples are full of stuff, because Sasekians don't have the same sort of reverence for austerity as the Asians do. The Asians don't really, prize personal possessions and stuff, but Sasekians have a large amount of, financial resources because they take stuff from people because that causes suffering, and that's kind of their whole jam. Do I have a secret organization of Sasekian rogues who run around stealing stuff to make other people's lives harder? Maybe. Maybe I do. Anyway, not important. So, the Grey Twins are a, marine core of Asians. They're, super powerful, and they travel in pairs, which is why they're called the Grey Twins. Grey is the color of Asia. And they dress themselves in Asian garb, which is usually, gray fabric, gray tabards, and stuff like that. And the way that they operate is one of them takes a whole bunch of vows, and one of them is silence. And the vow of silence isn't just, I'm not going to talk. It's that they don't communicate. They don't whistle, they don't hum, they try to sneeze quietly, they try to be as quiet as they can. And this is a great sacrifice because they're giving up their ability to connect with the outside world, which is, kind of the biggest sacrifice that a human being can make. And they are accompanied by their counterpart, who is not taking all of those vows. And that person does the talking and helps them navigate through the world and things like this. But when the Grey Twins come to town, people just take care of them. It's just this thing that they do because that's what you do. They are good. You know that they're good. Sometimes they do direct good things for the town, like healing or repairing things or offering counsel and stuff like that. So they are forces of good, and they just move through the world and everyone just takes care of them, which is kind of weird. But why? Why would you do that? That's something that I have to justify in my world because, nowadays if somebody just rolled into town and said, "Hi, I'm a good guy," we wouldn't take care of them, right? We would be like, "Oh, what do you want?" So the Grey Twins have this long history of doing great acts of good. And because of that history, it's become part of the culture to respect the Grey Twins. But due to the nature of what they do, because what they do is primarily hunt down Sasekians who are healers, this is often a difficult situation for the poorer places. And when you go to some place like Corvus, where they are very, very poor, there aren't a lot of Grey Twins. The Sasekian priests who go to these poor baronies and heal people are generally good. They're generally people who are embodying that healing aspect of Sesek, and so the Grey Twins just don't go to those places because they don't really have beef with the individual good Sasekian. The Grey Twins and the Asian Church know that their problem is not with the individuals who worship Sesek, it's with the structure of the Sasekian priesthood. And so they go after those structural elements. And without fail, when they defeat one of these Sasekian temples, the towns around them prosper and start doing better because they aren't being leeched by the Sasekian temple anymore. So the Grey Twins stay in the places where the trouble is, which means that there's a whole swath of territory that just has no idea who the Grey Twins are or what they do. And I love those kinds of details when I build them into my structures. Because it means that when my player characters travel from one place to another and they see things that are different or that are unfamiliar, they can talk to the local townspeople, and the local townspeople can tell them stories and the history and the fables that have built up around these, mysterious Grey Twins and all this kind of stuff. And I love that. And the reason why it works the way it does is because I've put the time and the energy into thinking about how the structure works and how it fits into the world and what the opposition is and what the consequences of that opposition are and what happens when those conflicts occur and what the fallout is, so that people can have opinions sort of in broad strokes about any organization or structure. Anyway, I will stop rambling now. Again, thank you for listening. I do really enjoy having a chance to share my thoughts and ideas and tell you a little bit about my big old stupid little world. So thank you, and I look forward to talking to you about geography next time. We're going to talk about the Crusades. Yeah, well, at least one of them. All right. Anyway, bye.